Hey all, it's Mr. P back again for another lesson in Unit 1 Basic Geometry. This time we're going to talk about our fourth concept, midpoint, and we'll be talking about the midpoint of segments. So we'll start with the vocabulary first. A midpoint is exactly what it sounds like. It's a point in the very middle of a segment. It breaks the segment up into two smaller segments that are both congruent. Remember again, that means that those two segments will be equal in length. Remember that these red slashes here through segment AM and segment MB mean that the length of AM is the same as MB. It means that those two segments are congruent. Remember again, if I'm talking too fast, pause the video so that you can get the vocabulary. Here's one way we can use our knowledge of midpoint to solve a problem in geometry. As always, pause the video here. See if you can find the length of PR, knowing that Q is the midpoint of segment PR. So since Q is the midpoint, we know that PR is divided into two congruent segments, PQ and QR. That means that their lengths are equal. So we can write an equation here that PQ is equal to QR. Then we can plug in the expressions that represent their lengths and solve for x. So we get that x is 3. Again, as in previous videos, we're looking for the length of PR, so we're not quite finished yet. We want to know how long this entire segment is. So we need to write another equation and plug in again. We know from segment addition that the two small segments should add up to be the entire big segment. So we can write this equation, the length of PR equals the length of PQ plus QR. We can plug in the expressions as we did before. We know what x is 3. And finally we can simplify. And we can find out the length of segment PR is 70. And I will circle or box my answer. We have another formula. We learned the distance formula in the last lesson. Here we're going to learn the midpoint formula. This will help us find the coordinates of a midpoint when we know the coordinates of two endpoints of a segment. So notice we have two endpoints labeled x1, y1, and x2, y2. They help us write this formula. M represents the label of the midpoint. So we're never going to have an equal sign here. M is the label for this point. This chunk of the formula here will give us the x coordinate of the midpoint. Sometimes refer to that as xm. And this chunk over here will give us the y coordinate of the midpoint, ym. So whenever we're finding a midpoint using the midpoint formula, we should end up with a point, so an x value, comma, y value in parentheses, and we'll have the label m, meaning midpoint in this case. So let's do an example together. If we want to find the midpoint, we'll call it m again, of segment EF. Given these two coordinates, we can use the midpoint formula. Just like in distance, we'll label one x1, y1 and one x2, y2. We always start with the formula. The more you write it, the better you remember it. And now we can just plug in our values for x1, y1 and x2, y2. And I've color coordinated the values. And we simplify. And we can leave them in fraction form. You can put them in decimal form. Either way is acceptable. I'm going to leave them in fraction form. So my midpoint is at 9/2, comma 1/2. So again, I have a point. I have coordinates. I have an x coordinate and a y coordinate. M is a label. And it's the midpoint of segment EF. Now pause the video and try this example on your own. It's very similar to the previous one, making sure that you write down the midpoint formula as you should every time. So I will always start these problems by labeling my points. One of them is x1, y1, the other one's x2, y2. I then write my formula, and I can plug and chug. I have to be careful here. It's easy to make a mistake plugging in numbers into the wrong spot, so be very careful making sure all the numbers go into the appropriate spots. And I can keep simplifying this to get that the midpoint is at 1/2, -7. Another way we can use midpoint in geometry is when we're looking for an endpoint. So we can manipulate the original midpoint formula to get two endpoint formulas. Here we are going to have equal signs. We're going to find the value of the x-coordinate that we call x2 and the y-coordinate y2. Those will be the coordinates that we put into point form to describe the endpoint that we're missing. So x1, y1 is an endpoint that we're given. xm, ym are the coordinates of the midpoint, and we're looking for the other endpoint, x2, y2. So let's do an example together. We're looking for one endpoint D of segment CD. We know that C is -5, 7. That's our x1, y1. And we know that the midpoint of this segment is -2, 1. That's our xm, ym. So we can use the two formulas, and we should always start by writing them down to find the x value of the other endpoint and the y value of the other endpoint. We'll find x first. We'll plug in what we know. We plug in the x value for the midpoint and the endpoint we do know. Simplify, and we get that the x value of the endpoint is 1. And do the same thing here to find the y value. And we get that the y value of the endpoint is -5. So we're not finished yet. We should have a point. Right now we have an x-coordinate and a y-coordinate, and they belong together in parentheses. Point D is at 1, -5. Pause the video and try this example. Make sure you write the formulas. As I've said in the past, you should write the formulas every time. Start by labeling my coordinates. L is x1, y1. M, the midpoint, is xm, ym. And let's go find the coordinates for the other endpoint, G. We'll write our formulas, and then we can just plug in and simplify. So our x-coordinate is -10. Our y-coordinate is -1. Again, we're not done. We need an xy in coordinate form. And I've mislabeled my answer. This should be L. And the coordinates for L are -10, -1. The other endpoint of segment LG with midpoint -3, -5. Try these three problems on your own. Make sure you click the link in the comments section or type this into your web browser. Make sure when you're putting your answers in for the midpoint and the endpoint that you use parentheses. You put a comma between the two values for x and y, and you don't put any spaces. So parentheses, a comma, and no spaces.